And now I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Jeffrey Selingo, author of the book, College Unbound, The Future of Higher Education and What It Means for Students. In addition to being an author, columnist, and sought-after speaker, he is also a contributing editor for the Chronicle of Higher Education and a professor at Arizona State University. He has spent his entire journalism career covering colleges and universities worldwide. Please welcome Jeffrey Selingo.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for being up so early this morning, bright and early on a conference day. It's great to be with you here in Philadelphia, the birthplace of the American ideal, and I hope to stretch your ideas this morning and think about new ideas for higher education. I come to you today to talk to you broadly about the big trends impacting colleges and universities, and the story I have to tell today is kind of it starts not so great, and it ends up in a very good position in my mind, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about where higher education has been and where it is right now, and then kind of talk a little bit about what I think the future is going to look like, both for students and for institutions. Right now, I think the enterprise of higher education is stronger than it's ever been, right? Think about it. More people around the world and in this country want access to a higher education than ever before. We know that a college degree is the ticket to the middle class, both here and around the world. But the problem right now, and as I will lay out for the first half of my talk this morning, is that the industry that's serving that enterprise is struggling right now, as there's many new competitors and there's many new ways of accessing education. And so while your own discipline might be very strong right now, I think that you need to think about what's going to be happening in the next 10 or 15 years with both institutions and students and be ready for that. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is in College Unbound, as was mentioned in my book that came out last year. And so I was covering higher education for 16 years when I started working on College Unbound. I was the editor of the Chronicle for 4 of those years, and 3 summers ago I was invited up to Harvard Business School. And Clay Christensen, who some of you may know, is the father of disruptive innovation, where he talks about every industry going through massive change, whether it's the last couple of years or the next 10 years, was about to come out with a book on higher education and how disruptive innovation was going to come to higher ed. This is about 3 years ago. And so I went up there to attend a day-long session that he was having on higher education. And half of what I heard in that room that day really frightened me and half fascinated me. And so I decided, I came back, I wrote a long memo to my boss and said I want to go out and investigate this. But then I started talking to parents and students who were thinking about going to college or were in college. And they were all thinking of their college experience through their own lens, through the lens of their parents or previous students, right? They started to think that the college experience for kids in 2015 or in 2020 or in 2025 was going to be the same as it was in 1985, 1990, and 1995. And so when I started writing this book, I decided to shift my lens a little bit. And I think this is an important thing to remember, especially as I talk today, that this book was really aimed at students and parents. I'm really happy that people in higher ed are reading it and are reacting to it. But the lens that I had was on students and parents and what they should expect in the next 10 or 15 years. So that's the number one thing that I want to start with today. Number two is that I've actually never worked on a college campus full-time. I'm a professor of practice at Arizona State, which means I teach some part-time classes out there. But I've actually never worked full-time on a college campus. So I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic researcher. Sometimes when I speak in front of academics, they'll ask me about my research methods, and I say in journalism, if you have 3 anecdotes, you have a trend. So if you ever want to know how those trend stories happen in the New York Times and elsewhere, it's 3 anecdotes, you get a trend. I come from it from a qualitative research position where I go out, I interview the experts, I look at the research, and then I translate it for the audience. So I think those are 2 important things to remember, that I speak from the perspective of students and parents, number one, and number two, that I approach this from the outside, as an outsider. as a journalist. So the past 2 decades in higher education have experienced tremendous growth. You all know that from your own campuses, right? Undergraduate enrollment ballooned in the last decade. Graduate enrollment ballooned. Continuing education enrollment ballooned. And if you've been looking at the statistics just coming out from the education department, we know that enrollment in higher education has fallen almost by 1 million students just over the last 2 years. And what has really, I think, fueled the growth of higher education over the last couple of decades is this prestige race, right? So back in 1995, I interned for US News and World Report and worked on the annual college rankings back then, which were not as big of a business as they are today. But what US News and World Report rankings, and now rankings of any kind, it doesn't seem like a week goes by where yet another rankings come out. What has happened was that they all led institutions to be like one another, right? And so what ended up happening was that every institution wanted to be like their peers, or more important, like 1 or 2 rungs up the ladder, because that's where they wanted to be. And the thing about all of these rankings is that they're all based on inputs. Most of them are based on inputs. That is, what's coming in the door. The students coming in the door, the faculty coming in the door, right? So if you look at the US News and World Report rankings, they're based on, SAT scores and class rank for students. For faculty, they're based on ratios, student-faculty ratio. They're based on faculty salaries. They're based on highest degrees for faculty. They're all based on inputs. And what I think is going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years is that the prestige race, first of all, I think is going to slow down because most institutions can't afford it, can't afford to spend more money on all those inputs. But it's going to be based much more on outputs, on what actually colleges and universities are producing. And those colleges and universities that I think are going to survive and thrive in the next 20 years are those that have good data about what their students and faculty are doing and are able to tell great stories about that. And I'm going to talk a lot about the value proposition of higher education today because I think this is going to become critically important in the next 20 years. Because for right now, most institutions aren't willing to step away from the herd, right? There's this herd mentality. While we have a lot of diversity in American higher education, 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, publics, privates, because everybody wants to win at this prestige race, there tends to be institutions that look a lot alike. I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years on college and university campuses, and everybody wants to show me their innovative programs and innovative departments, but that's what they are, right? The innovation is happening within individual departments, within individual schools, on the corners of campus, not at the central part of campus. And that is what I think is going to change in the next 10 or 20 years as we have to define the value of higher education more and more. So Clay Christensen, who I mentioned earlier when I went to his session at Harvard Business School a couple of years ago, he wrote this in the New York Times a couple of months ago. And this is incredibly popular prediction now, right? Most places, most colleges and universities, many colleges and universities are going to go out of business in the next 10, 15 years, as he predicts bottom 25%. I actually don't agree with this prediction, even though this is a popular prediction these days. It's very difficult to put a college or university out of business. And I think that when people invite me to speak or they see the title of my book, they think that, oh, he's going to predict that everyone's going to go online in the future. And actually, I'm not here to talk about that today. I'll tell a little bit about how students want some injection of technology into their daily lives. But if you look at any survey of 18-year-olds, they don't want to go to school online, right? I'm not here to say that colleges and universities are going to go out of business because I think it's very difficult to put a college or university out of business. And I think many of them have really good strengths that they're not leveraging enough, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. And then finally, there's a lot of talk about the death of the liberal arts today, right? That liberal arts foundation that many of us have, that we build disciplinary expertise on top of. Again, I don't think that's going to happen either, because what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is because of the changes in the economy, I think that liberal arts foundation is actually more important than ever before because of rapid changes in the economy. But that doesn't mean that higher education is not going to go through massive change in the next 10 or 15 years. So just think about what it was like to be in the boardrooms of any of these companies over the last 15 years, right? The boardroom of Blockbuster when Netflix came along, or Amazon, when Borders when Amazon came along, or Tower Records when iTunes came along, or now to be in the boardroom of Apple when they decide they have to go out and buy Beats music because people are now not downloading music, they're streaming music, and we have to constantly change. I saw this in my own industry over the last 20 years in journalism. You know, there's half as many reporters now employed in newspapers as there were back in 2000, and we would sit in rooms like this back in the late 1990s, right? It would be publishers and reporters and editors, and we'd be hearing somebody up at the front of the room, much like I am right now, talking about the future, right? And we would all be shaking our heads. Well, you know, this person would be talking about how people would be reading a newspaper on a computer screen instead of getting a newspaper on their front door. And we'd all be shaking our heads because we'd hubris, right? We're the best in the world, right? We're a public trust. Everyone will always want us. Even in the face of the statistics that we were seeing, we didn't want to believe it, right? Never did anybody predict within a decade or so that we would be reading news on devices as small as this, right? So change came to all of these other industries. Change is going to come to higher education. And one of the biggest reasons I think that change is coming is because of the students already in the system, and more important, the students coming through the system. So for most of probably your careers in higher education, most institutions think of students in these two ways, right? Traditional and non-traditional. I hear presidents tell me this all the time. We serve a traditional student base or a non-traditional student base. Traditional 18 to 22-year-old or 24-year-old, and non-traditional kind of everybody else, everybody above 24, right? And we know today, by the way, that actually the non-traditional students are the traditional students, right? There's more people with some college credit and no degree than there are students, or there are people out there with college degrees, and as a result, more and more people are coming back to school. But when we think of students in only these two ways, I think that most institutions end up serving students in ways that are convenient to them, to the institution, rather than in ways that are convenient to the students. And I think that these are very one-dimensional ways of looking at students, and they don't look at the mindsets and the motivations for why students go to college, right? We tend to group them by demographics rather than the motivations of why they go to college. So a couple of months ago, I worked with the Parthenon group out of Boston, and we surveyed 3,000 people across the country who were either in college or thinking about going to college, all different age groups. And we asked them about their demographics, their backgrounds, but we asked them about why they were motivated to go to college, and then we separated those motivations into what we called 6 segments. 6 segments. So instead of 2 segments of students, we ended up with these 6 segments of students. And some of them are more in the traditional 18 to 24-year-old, right? But they're very different. Even within that 18 to 24-year-old, there are very different motivations for why people go to college, right? There's the young academics. Those are the students at the top of their class, right? High SAT scores, and by the way, they typically come from high-income families. Presidents love these students, right? When I hear presidents tell me the types of students that they want to enroll, they talk about the young academics, which is why they throw out so much merit aid to attract those students, right? And it's partially because of that prestige race I was talking about earlier, right? Those students really help the rankings. But between 18 to 24-year-olds, there's also many other types of students based on motivations, right? There's the coming-of-age group, right? Students who go to college not quite sure what they want to do, but it's a maturing experience for them. And then there's the career starters, an increasing number of students in this group. These are students who go to college thinking of it as a means to an end. They want to get in and get out as quickly as possible because they want to start their career. And in many ways, those students at the age of 18 actually have more in common with some adult students who are coming back to school to accelerate in their career, right? They're in a career, but they need more additional training and accelerate in their career, or industry switchers. These are people who are either employed or unemployed and need to realize that the economy is changing and they want a new career, or adult wanderers. These are students who come back to school not quite sure what they want to do, but they know they need a degree to succeed in life. And what is interesting about this study that we did is that even though there were quite big differences in ages and other demographics, there was actually much more in common between some of these students because of their motivations and mindsets for going back to college. And what ends up happening now is that because I think many institutions look too much alike, is that they end up serving students in very similar ways, although they're not homogeneous in terms of why they want to go to college. And this, to me, is key, because those young academics I was talking about that many institutions want to go after, they only make up, while they make up the largest portion of the population out there, they only make up about a quarter of the potential students out there. And so what's happening right now is that I don't think most institutions are thinking enough about the mindsets and motivations of their students and why they want to come to their institution. And there's simply not enough of that one group of students that so many institutions are after to go around, to spread around. And this, to me, is the biggest red light out there flashing for colleges and universities. And in fact, in the last 2 years, the Chronicle of Higher Education has taken a survey of college leaders, and we found out that half of American colleges and universities last year either missed their enrollment goal or missed their budget goal for the year. In other words, to fill all those seats, they had to actually offer more financial aid than they predicted. Half of American colleges and universities. So we tend to think a lot about student debt in this country, right? And this is why I think that institutions are going to need to rethink who they're admitting and how they're admitting them. Because the financial model for most colleges and universities is simply not sustainable. So we talk a lot about student debt. This is the number for debt held by colleges and universities across the country, right? Almost doubled since 2001. Now, it's fine, right? We all have debt, right? We have debt for our houses and for our cars and everything else. But we expect to have a job to pay off that debt, right? We expect to have income come in, and we hope over time more income will come in, right? Well, the problem now, according to Moody's, 75% of American colleges and universities have either flat or declining net tuition revenue, right? That's the cash they have on hand after they put out financial aid to start new programs, to invest in new buildings, to invest in faculty, and so forth. 75% of American colleges and universities, also the money that they have to pay off this debt. And even if American colleges and universities kind of were able to figure out that debt picture in some ways, they're now facing a change in the American population. So this chart shows the percentage of income from the median family and what percentage of income it takes to pay for the median college tuition, 4 years, sticker price, across the country. And what this shows is that back in 2001, it took the median family less than 25% of their income to pay for college. And today, it takes over 40%. 40%. And what worries me is that if you look at the 450 counties, there are 450 counties in the country where there are more younger students than older students. And all but 100 of them have median incomes under $50,000, right? That's the future. That's the future. And one of the reasons why this has gone up is not necessarily only because of tuition, but because median income in the US is flat and falling. And so colleges and universities have to be prepared for this and have to be prepared for this next generation of students that are coming down the pipeline who will have less money to pay for college, although more than 90% of them want to go to college. So this is how we typically view higher education, right? Mostly from the movies, right? We all have seen many of these movies, and we think of this Monsters University down there on the left side. When the writers and producers of Monsters University wanted to figure out what a college campus looks like to draw it, right, for the movie, they went to 3. They went to Harvard, they went to Berkeley, and they went to MIT. Because in their mind, that's what college looks like, right? I call this, in my book, the Hollywood version of American higher education. Because only 2 out of 10 students today goes to a residential college full-time and graduates in 4 years. 2 out of 10, right? So we tend to think of college as that residential experience. You go to at 18, once in your life, you spend 4 years there, maybe you go on to graduate school. But for most students, That's not the experience. 80% of students don't experience what we see in movies and television all the time in American higher education. And even for those students who get to college and go to the residential college, there's a lot of changes happening right now, right? A third of students now transfer at least once before they earn a bachelor's degree. 1 in 3 students, according to the National Student Clearinghouse, transfer at least once before they get a bachelor's degree. 4 out of 5 tell researchers they're drifting through college. They're not quite sure why they're there, right? And except at 18, I think in this country, we don't have a lot of options, right? You could go to the military, and that's a declining option for some students. You could live at home, and most parents don't want you for their kids to stay at home. You could go to get a job, and we know not a very good job right now with a high school diploma, or you could go to college, right? We don't have enough gap year experiences and other experiences. I'm not part of this don't go to college crowd, right? But we don't have enough experiences that kind of ease students into college more than they should. And this is why many of them end up as part of this statistic. 400,000 students dropping out of college every year. And for those students who end up making it to the other side, we now have employers who say colleges are not necessarily giving them the skills they really need, right? We have many programs giving them the technical skills they need, but when you look at surveys of employers, this is what they say over and over again, that their college, the top skills they need in today's college graduates, and they're not always getting. And I think right now there is a bigger divide. When I go out there and I talk to folks at colleges and I talk to employers, I think there's a bigger divide now than ever before between what the higher education system is producing and what the employment market needs. And part of that is because I think we have way more expectations, particularly for the bachelor's degree, than we've ever had before. Think about it, right? 20, 30 years ago, when fewer people needed a bachelor's degree to succeed in life, we used to think about going to get a bachelor's degree as kind of getting the broad education, right? And then you would get that bachelor's degree, you would come out, you would get trained in a job, or you go to graduate school and get trained in a specific discipline, or you go to professional school and get trained in a specific profession. We now expect both of those things to happen in tandem, especially at the undergraduate level. Training and the broad education, the liberal arts and the practical arts, which is why on many campuses I see a lot of battles between faculty members over requirements, right? Between the practical arts and the liberal arts. And oh, by the way, 40% of students now come to college not prepared to do college level work, so we now have to add a lot of remedial classes into that bucket. We expect experiential learning, right? We expect students off campus as much as they're on campus, whether they're in internships or study abroad. And we expect all of this to happen in 4 years, right? I call it the overworked bachelor's degree because the expectations for the bachelor's degree, I think, are higher than ever before. And one of the things I want you to think about today, and one of the ways I want you to stretch your thinking, is to think about how we can stretch higher education over the course of a lifetime much more than we do today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So this is how the traditional model of life and work has gone for the last 30 or 40 years, right? Basically post-World War II, right? It's the situation. My father came out of college, right? Went to work at one place, worked there for 30 years, one employer, essentially one job for 30 years, and then he retired. Right? This was mostly what the baby boom generation and previous generations went through. This is now changing, right? There's now a big shift happening, and we can look at the labor statistics to see this new model. And this new model was designed by Tony Carnevale, who's an economist at Georgetown University. And he noticed, beginning in the 80s, what he calls a shift to the right on work and life, right? And so what would happen is now you would graduate from college, and instead of diving right into a career and right into a job that you would spend 30 years at, you were moving through what he calls a learning and earning phase, right? You would move between multiple jobs, multiple internships, you would go back to school, and it takes many people now several years to kind of figure out their career, and in some cases figure out their job. And then you would get on the job, and by the way, training would never end, right? Constantly be trained and retrained. Eventually you would transition to retirement and full retirement. So one of the things he's noticed is that the average age, how many in this room have students in their 20s, have kids in their 20s, or are in their 20s? Wow, decent amount. So one of the things he noticed was that the average age of financial independence for college graduates today is 30. 30, right? So this whole idea of, kids in their 20s, moving back home, living with mom and dad, it's actually true, right? 30. Back in 1981, it was 25, right? So since 1981, it has moved from 25 to 30. And financial independence, meaning they earn the median wage and their student debts are at a much lower rate than when they graduate from college, 30 to reach that, right? But yet we think of college and we think of the career, we think of people in their 20s as kind of in a career already. And I think this has major implications for colleges and universities in terms of serving those students in their 20s as they're trying to launch into their career. And this is actually the topic of my next book. I'm going to be looking at how students in their 20s are launching into careers and how it's changed in the last 20 or 30 years. And I'll be talking about that in a moment. So I started to think about writing College Unbound when my second daughter was born. So I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old at home. And for many of you who have young kids or had young kids, this is probably the first thing you think about when you have kids. Wow, how am I going to pay for college, right? And so, they're going to be going to college at the end of next decade. And if they went to, one of the most expensive private colleges, it would be $237,000 for 4 years of tuition only. I wouldn't figure out how they would live. And if they just went to the average private college, $160,000. And if they went to a public, it would be $97,000 for sticker price over 4 years. But as I was thinking about their future, I was also thinking about how different their lives would be than my life or my parents' life, right? How different their lives would be by the time they would get to college at the end of next decade. For number one, a third of kids born today might live to see their 100th birthday. A third. But yet again, we think of college, going back to that Hollywood version of college, right? We think of college as one physical place we go to one time in our life, usually at the age of 18, right? And spend 4 years there and maybe go on to graduate school from there, right? Even though we're living much longer and, as Tony Carnevale shows us, we're working much longer and the whole work-life transition has changed. We also are moving through jobs and careers much more than ever before, right? We're going to move through multiple jobs and in some cases, perhaps multiple careers, right? I know that most of you are probably hoping that the students in your programs are going to be in PA for the rest of their lives, but they may not. In fact, if you look at any of the statistics, they're going to have multiple careers throughout their lifetime. But yet, what is the second question we typically ask somebody after we ask them where they're going to college? We ask them what they're going to major in, right? We ask them at the age of 18 to pick a major for the rest of their life, rather than ask them what problems they want solved. Or one thing that Stanford University is thinking about is instead of majors to have missions, right? What is the mission that they want to have in life? So it's these changes in demographics and in the financial models of higher education that is really at the center of my book. It's these changes that I think are going to lead to this unbundled future that is at the thesis of College Unbound, where knowledge is not a commodity that is delivered from teacher to student, or from me today, from the stage to a group of students in the classroom, but rather something that emerges from a curiosity-fueled exploration of the student, where the student is much more at the center of his or her education. And one that is not an education just of 4 years or 5 years or 8 years, but one that is much more lifelong, right? One that enables you to learn, unlearn, and relearn throughout your lives, because this is the skill of the 21st century. And this, to me, necessitates that colleges and universities become platforms for lifelong learning, rather than a box that you kind of enter at one point in your life and then exit and move on into your career. So what might something like this look like? First of all, it's not one pathway, right? students are going to continue to take that pathway that we all normally think of college, right? 18 to 22, maybe go on to graduate school, right? That 20% of those students are always going to be around, right? But as we know, there's much more than that that motivates students to go to college. And to me, the colleges that are going to survive and thrive in the future, and the disciplines that are going to survive and thrive in the future, are those that create multiple pathways for students. Some students will be able to figure this out on their own and mix and match different ways of getting education. But for the most part, they're going to need a roadmap. They're going to need help along the way to mix and match these experiences. And so that will be mixing and matching, by the way, traditional face-to-face education, online education, and hybrid education, a mix of both, right? It'll be a mix of residential experiences and low residency experiences, right? So think of the biggest, fastest growing, newest college and university out there, the Minerva Project. I don't know how many of you heard of it, right? It's experiential. It's a new experience that was just started. Larry Summers, former president of Harvard, is one of the backers. They just got $75 million in funding yesterday. They had 3,000 applicants for their pilot class of 25. 3,000 applicants for their pilot class of 25. And the key is the last piece there. It's low residency, right? They start the year in San Francisco, but their classroom is the world, and they take their professors and their students around the world where they do the learning and the experiencing in cities in the US and around the world. It's a low residency model, but it mixes and matches traditional classroom education, which they'll get in San Francisco, with a mixture of low residency models, right? Apprenticeships and internships, experiential learning. So we're going to see, everybody wants to know what is the silver bullet for the future of higher ed. And as I said in the beginning, there's not one silver bullet. Everybody thinks, oh, well, we'll just go to school online, when not everyone wants to go online. So there's going to be mixing and matching of experiences much more than we have today, which will mean that institutions won't be that one-size-fits-all model that many follow today. You know, many students are already following this. We tend to call them non-traditional now, right? They follow non-traditional pathways to college. But increasingly, they're becoming traditional. And if you read College Unbound, I profiled a couple of these students in the book, and I want to briefly mention a couple of them today to talk about their pathways and why they're important for you to think about. The first is the student who moves among multiple institutions. So the idea of the student swirl in higher education was first coined back in the 70s and 80s. And students who would move among multiple institutions were always seen as, well, they can't quite get it together financially or academically, right? They can't quite afford college, and so they move on, or they can't quite get it together academically. And as I mentioned earlier, a third of students now, 1/3 of students are now transferring at least once before they earn a bachelor's degree. And they're not always doing it because they can't hack it or they can't afford college. They're now seeing this as a pathway through college. So this is Jose James, who I met at Valencia College in Florida, who pieced together, thanks to a pathway that the state of Florida created for him, from Valencia to the University of Central Florida to the University of Florida to get his master's degree in architecture at half the cost of what it would cost if he had gone to those three institutions separately. And in fact, what you're seeing now is nearly a quarter of students at community colleges now come from families making over $100,000 a year. Back in 2008, before the financial crisis, that was under 10%. Under 10%. So you now see families who have the financial wherewithal and usually the sophistication deciding, you know what, my son or daughter doesn't necessarily have to spend 4 years at one institution to get his or her education. I think the idea of swirling students is only going to increase in the coming years, particularly as college becomes more expensive. And that has implications for institutions that think they have to do all of the education on their campus, and has implications for programs as well. And we know that the bachelor's degree or the master's degree is more than just a random collection of credits, right? There's a curriculum behind it. And I think that there is a role for colleges and universities to figure out how can we certify the learning that happened elsewhere and be the end result for that student, right? That they come to our campus, and maybe we don't have them for 4 years, but maybe we have them for 2 or 3 years, and we certify all the experiences they come to us with, whether it's the experiential learning outside the classroom or the classroom learning that they come from other colleges and universities. Because if 25% of families making over $100,000 are already sending their kids to community colleges, you're going to see more and more of that in the coming years. Second is this idea of mixing course types. And I talked earlier, most students don't want to go to school fully online, right? But that doesn't mean they don't want technology injected some way into their curriculum. And what's interesting to me as I move around colleges and universities, I've spoken at a lot over the last year, and I visited many, not only in my career at the Chronicle, but also to report the book, is you would go to a college, and the president would introduce me to the person in charge of, residential learning, obviously usually the provost, and then there would be somebody in charge of online education and somebody in charge of hybrid education, right? We have silos in higher ed. We've always had silos in higher ed, right? Departments don't talk to departments, institutions don't talk to institutions, and now we've replicated that in this new world, right? There's hybrid education, there's online education, and there is face-to-face education, even though most students want to move seamlessly between them. And so Jennifer Black, who was a student at the University of Central Florida when I met her, took a quarter of her classes, even though she was a residential student, in either online or hybrid format. She moved very easily between all three, which enabled her to graduate in 4 years and have a minor and work and have internships. That overworked bachelor's degree I was talking about earlier, right, where we have all of these requirements, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level, allowing the mixing of course types allows students a lot more flexibility, yet too many institutions, not all, but too many institutions are thinking of these as very separate things. And then finally, the idea of competency-based education, the idea that education should be based on what you know and credit should be based on what you know rather than how much time you spend in a seat. So I profile Cheryl Shue in the book, who I met near my hometown of Washington, D.C., where she went to Western Governors University and earned her bachelor's degree in 2.5 years and paid $18,000. Her longest class there was 14 weeks. Her shortest class was 2 weeks. She spent time on what she didn't know and moved through what she already knew. More than 300 colleges now have some sort of competency-based education as part of their curriculum, more than 300. And last year, 3 very traditional colleges started big programs: Northern Arizona, University of Wisconsin System, and Southern New Hampshire. Of all of the quote-unquote innovations in higher ed, I think this is the one, particularly for older students, but even for 18-year-olds, that I think has the potential to take off, because it changes the cost curve in higher education, because it reduces the time to degree and focuses students on what they don't know rather than what they know. But there's another trend that I've noticed, and largely since the book came out, so I don't talk much about this in the book, but this is this trend toward other providers showing up and giving lifelong education to students. So all of these names up here have appeared in the last 5 or 6 years, right? And many of them are probably pretty familiar to you. The Khan Academy, Skill Crush, Coursera and edX, the 2 big MOOC providers, are up there, lynda.com, and so forth. There's one up there in particular that I want to profile. How many of you have heard of General Assembly? Okay. So General Assembly has served 100,000 students in just the last 3 years. Started by 3 guys who graduated from Wharton, right? And they now are in 9 cities, 1 in London and 8 here in the US. And they teach everything from project management to computer coding to design thinking in courses that run anywhere from a couple of hours and cost $75 to 11 weeks and cost $11,000. So they opened up in DC last year. And I was kind of curious to see, mostly in person, by the way, very little of their work is done online. And I was kind of curious to see who was going to these classes. So I went down. First of all, they're selling out of almost every single one of their classes they have in DC. The average age of their student is 25, and 99% of them have a bachelor's degree. 99% have a bachelor's degree. And they're going back to get skills they didn't necessarily get in college, right? They're going back to get those skills and paying all this money. And when I talked to a lot of these students, they said, wow, I really wish I got this in college, or I wish that my college offered something like this for folks who in their 20s, for alumni in their 20s, right? It's this idea of lifelong education that goes beyond graduation day, that I think colleges and universities are really missing this opportunity. And companies like General Assembly, which most students hadn't even heard of, but they're willing to take a chance on it, and in many cases their job placement rate is very high, are taking that market away from students. 100,000, or away from colleges, 100,000 students in the last couple of years, which is why even institutions like Stanford are thinking about this, right? So this is a project that Stanford, it's called Stanford 2025, and a couple of months ago, well, last year, and they came out with the results a couple of months ago. Last year, the Stanford administration asked its design school, if you know anything about Stanford, you know they have a world-renowned design school. They asked Stanford to rethink undergraduate education at the university in the year 2025. They went off and they did it as a design project, and they came back with what they called 4 provocations, right? One of them I mentioned earlier, this idea of doing away with majors and instead having these missions. The other idea they came back with is what they called the open loop university. And so instead of getting access to 4 years of education when you're accepted to Stanford, you would get access to 6 years that you could use any time throughout your life. 6 years of education any time throughout your life. So you could loop in at the age of 18 and take the traditional undergraduate market or undergraduate degree, and you would loop out at 22 or so, and then you would have access to 2 more years of education the rest of your life. Or you could loop out after 2 years, go work for a Silicon Valley startup, and then come back after it fails and finish up your degree. But just think about this. Think about the platform, the University for Life platform that Stanford is now thinking about providing its students. And this idea that instead of going back to General Assembly or lynda.com or edX or whatever, they will now continue to be lifelong students at Stanford. This has big implications for the degree and what the degree means. It has big implications for undergraduate education, where you might have students from different generations and different experiences all in the same class, right? But it offers this idea that education is no longer this box that we offer for 4 years or 7 years or 8 years, but something that we're going to need throughout our lifetime. So I want to end by talking briefly about where I started, and this was the value of higher education. So remember I talked about all of those companies at the beginning. This is a quote from Amazon, one of the most hated companies. I always hate to use this quote, but I think it's a good quote because if you think about all those companies I showed you earlier, right? The Blockbuster, the companies that don't exist anymore, the Blockbusters of the world, the Tower Records of the world, the Borders of the world. One of the things they didn't recognize is that the distance between the producer and the consumer was shrinking, right? The middleman was going away. The middleman in higher education being institutions, right? So think about it. If we apply this to institutions, and what implications does that have for colleges and universities? I think it offers both risks and opportunities. So I think there's plenty of opportunities here. Now, we tend to think about this right now in the context of MOOCs, right? Massively open online courses. How many of you have taken a MOOC? Few. How many of you have completed one? A lot fewer, right? But one of the things the MOOC does, right, is it shrinks the distance between the professor and the student, right? I don't have to go and apply for a program, go down the street to my local college or apply to a national online program, right? I could sign up for a Coursera class on a Saturday night, be in their experience within a couple of minutes, and I could finish that class within a couple of days if I wanted to. And by the way, I could take that class however I want. I could watch a couple of lectures. I could look at a couple of the readings, right? I could take it however I want. It shrinks the distance between the teacher and the student. And by the way, it's not just these massively online open courses that I think that institutions need to be worried about, but it's also the idea of the free agent professor. So this is MR University, which most of you probably never heard of, but it was started by Tyler Cowen, who's an economist at George Mason university. George Mason was not jumping on the MOOC bandwagon, as many institutions weren't. And so he decided, you know what, I have a popular blog called Marginal Revolution. I reach hundreds of thousands of people in a year through that blog. I'm going to put my course materials online for free. And that's exactly what he did. He went home, he got a $5 iPad app, he recorded his lectures, and then he put all his materials online, called himself a university, MR University. No credit, it's free, right? He's still teaching at George Mason, but for somebody like me who wants to learn about economics, I can now go on there and I could download this material and watch these courses. He has reached more people in 6 months of doing this than he did in a decade plus of teaching at George Mason. So as a professor, great news if you want to reach a wider audience and have bigger impact. And as a student, if you're a student right now, or even any of us as students, this is a great time, right? Because again, you don't have to, apply for a program, wait to hear if you're accepted. You can now start to put, and there's some bad content out there, there's no doubt about that, but we have now unbundled the content and the professor from the university in many ways. Now, he's still teaching there. He hasn't figured out a way to make money there, so he's only part way down this path. But this idea of the free agent professor being unbundled from the university, I think is critical because we see this in these other industries that have been disrupted over time, right? Music, where musicians can now reach directly out to the people listening to their music, or authors like me who can reach directly out to readers, where we don't need the middleman anymore. So what does this mean for your programs, for your institutions? And I think this is a key question that we need to ask. And I ask college officials this all the time, and they're like, oh, that's easy to figure out what we're doing that's innovative and truly differentiating, and what we're doing that's a commodity, right? And then you get 10 of them around a room, and every single one of them gives a different answer, right? The amount of knowledge in the world is ever increasing, right? And so colleges and universities want to add more. They never want to take anything away, right? They always want to add more. And then when you get 10 people in a room to figure out what they should take away, no one agrees, right? It's very hard, even though this seems like a very simple question, it's very difficult for most people to decide what is truly innovative about what they're doing. But increasingly, I think that's what you need to do in order to prove your value in the future. As I said earlier, the next 10 years in higher education are going to be about this value race, not about the prestige race that I think defined the last 10 years. So this is a question that has been asked by Carnegie, by Time Magazine, by the Chronicle of Higher Education, and by the Pew Research Center over the last couple of years. And they've asked 3 distinct groups this question about rating value for the money spent by students and their parents. And so they asked parents who are sending their kids to college and about that college. They asked presidents about their institutions, and they asked faculty members about the students they were teaching, their institutions. So the percentage of the public, or the percentage of people giving it a good or excellent rating at the top of the scale, 40% of the public, and that's been pretty flat. So only 40% of the public think they're getting a good or excellent value for the money being spent at their institution. Presidents think they're doing a terrific job, right? So when presidents talk about their own institutions, they think, wow, we're doing a terrific job. And when we surveyed, the Chronicle surveyed 3,000 faculty members last year, I actually thought the faculty numbers would be near the presidents, right? Faculty think they're doing a great job. They actually ended up being closer to the public. It was very interesting. This actually number really surprised me. And so we did a lot of follow-up interviews with faculty who talked a lot about what I talk about in chapter 3 of my book, this idea of student as consumer, right? This idea that the classroom is not as rigorous as it used to be. And thus, students are actually not getting a good value for their money as a result. And this is what they were worried about. And to me, institutions, programs, defining the value of what they're doing is going to become critically important in the next 10 years. Because if you don't define your value, someone else is going to do it for you, right? These are the LinkedIn, you may have seen some of these. These are the LinkedIn university pages, right? They have one for basically every college and university out there. Think about it. LinkedIn has 300 million members. When one of its members switches jobs, it's more likely to tell LinkedIn than it is to tell your institution, right? And so over the last couple of years, they've started to aggregate all of this data. And so now you can go on LinkedIn and you could find what a particular class at a particular institution is doing, right? Where they're living, the types of careers they have, who they're endorsed by. And 2 weeks ago, LinkedIn announced they're getting into the ratings game and the rankings game, right? And so now they're able to rank colleges based on these outcomes, right? And as last year I went out to visit the product team at LinkedIn that's putting this together, and as they started talking, I started to think that they could become the U.S. News and World Report rankings in the next 10 years, right? Think about it, right? They were saying, well, if you want to become a VP for marketing at a Fortune 500 company, we could tell you not only where they went to college, but we could tell you all the jobs they held before they held that top job, right? And we can say these 50 institutions and these 50 type of jobs are more likely to lead to that one, right? Based on those outcomes. And the other thing is that LinkedIn is now going down even further into colleges, right? So one of the things that they're working on now with a bunch of colleges is this pilot program where they're allowing students to put their courses on their LinkedIn profile, and they're actually connecting directly into the registration systems at colleges and universities. So it gets pre-populated. As long as students say, yes, it's fine to go into my registration system. So now, instead of just tracking degrees 10 years later, they can start actually tracking individual courses. Well, we all know going to college is much more than about getting a job and how much you make in that job, right? We know that there's much more value to higher education. For the most part, those value conversations have centered around anecdotes, right? Remember, going back to the earlier point, right? Three anecdotes equal a trend. Well, it won't anymore in higher ed, right? Because data like this is going to be able to trump the anecdotes that many institutions tell about their students. You know, when I was editor of the Chronicle, I would have a college president come through my office at least once or twice a week. And they would always tell me about their successful graduates or their successful undergraduates, right? 1 or 2 students. And I always wondered what happened to everybody else, right? Anecdotes are great, and storytelling is great, but it has to be, the foundation of that has to be the data. And others are doing it now, right? Other outsiders, and they're defining your value the way they think value should be defined. So it's not just LinkedIn, it's the education department, which is thinking about this new ratings plan. It's the state plans now where they link together unemployment insurance data, where they get salaries with college graduates, and so they're able to tell you what the average college graduate from one institution makes compared to another. So there's all of these outside efforts happening. And I think you have time, but I think that increasingly individual programs and institutions are going to have to define the value of their own college or their own program, right? Everybody knows going to college is worth it. I told you that earlier. More than 90% of Americans want to send their kids to college. But once they have tools like this, they're going to be able to compare college A and college B based on outputs, not the inputs that have really defined the rankings over the last 20+ years. So almost every decade since the beginning of time, somebody has predicted the end of higher education as we know it. And hopefully I didn't do that today. Hopefully I outlined why I think higher education is going to change, and in some ways change for the better. But this is a cover from Newsweek magazine back in April of 1976, right? And in this story, they basically said, you know, too many people are going to college. We have an overeducated America, and in the next 10 years, hundreds of colleges are going to go out of business. It sounds like a familiar refrain, right? If you've been reading the news over the last couple of years, this could have been written back in 1976. Now, Newsweek is out of business today, but more colleges and universities have opened since 1976 than have closed. More have opened than have closed since 1976. So these predictions of change sometimes work out, but most of the time don't. You know, one of the things that I learned in reporting the book is that we tend to overestimate the speed of change, right? We always tend to say, well, change is going to happen, it's going to come tomorrow. But we tend to underestimate the depth of change. Remember, I was telling you earlier, when I was sitting in rooms like this in the late 1990s, right? No one predicted that we would be reading news on devices as small as this within a decade. So we tend to underestimate the depth of change. So I might come back here 10 years from now, things could be much different and much deeper than we expect today. I appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for getting up so early. We have about 10 minutes or so for questions. And there's a microphone in the middle of the room, and I look forward to hearing your comments or questions. Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. I'm not sure if
Yeah, it's working.
So I was wondering if Alexander Aston's work about faculty student engagement or student engagement is still relevant in the time of, I mean, you spend a lot we talk about buildings, we talk about technology and delivery systems, but there's no discussion about engagement and how that relates. Are you finding that still relevant?
So remember the slide I showed you between innovation and a commodity, right? What's the commodity? To me, the residential experience, many parts, not all parts, but many parts of the residential experience are still the innovative position, and particularly engagement with faculty. I think faculty, to me, are the key. And what's interesting to me is as colleges and universities have been trying to save money over the last 10 years, they've been moving away from a full-time faculty model. I'm not going to get into the whole tenure debate, right? But they've been actually moving away from a full-time faculty model. And if you look at not only the work of Aston, but if you look at the work of the Student Engagement Survey and the high-impact practices that George Q at Indiana has talked about, right? We know that a strong faculty-student mentorship really works, right? We saw this recently. I don't know if any of you saw the results of the Purdue Gallup index, right? They came out with this index a couple of months ago that aggregates all of this Gallup data over the years, right? They know a lot about people because they ask questions essentially every night. And one of the things they found is that people were twice as likely to be engaged in their jobs and twice as likely to be saying that they lead a happy life if two things were present from their college days. One was they had a college professor who encouraged them to follow their dreams and mentored them on that pathway. And two, that they had a deep experiential learning opportunity. Internship, study abroad, undergraduate research, you name it. Those things, in my opinion, can only happen in a physical environment, right? Those are the things I think colleges and universities should double down on, right? And kind of get away from all the other frills that tend not to necessarily focus on those areas. And in fact, in my mind, what is truly innovative about the residential experience are the faculty and student relationships, the undergraduate research, the ability to do research, because I think most employers, when I talk to most employers, they're really impressed with students who had deep research experience for a couple of reasons. It enabled them to work in teams, critically important in most workplaces today. It enabled them to try to figure out a solution to a problem without knowing it in advance, right? So many things, we want to know the answer to so many things up front, right? We don't want to figure them out. The critical thinking skills that come from research, very important, right? The idea to fail sometimes, right? And I think one of the things that has happened, especially in this consumer mentality in higher ed, is that most colleges and universities have added in the student affairs area, right? They don't allow students to fail anymore, right? Everything has to be perfect. And then students get into the workplace and they don't know how to deal with failure. And then fourth is a cross-cultural experience, which is I also think is one huge benefit of a residential campus. And it's not studying abroad, right? But a campus is really the last stew of America, right? It's where people come together with different perspectives and different backgrounds. It doesn't happen online, right? We tend to connect and friend with people that are more like us and agree with us. So in terms of, as we think what should be truly innovative about what we're doing, I think that we should focus on those things that have high impact and have high engagement with students, and then push away everything else. And the problem is, again, when I go to campuses, there's a lot of disagreement on what is truly high impact and what isn't. And that's the problem to get there. Another question.
Thank you. One of my questions was, across as you were looking through this information and meeting with different stakeholders, was wondering what engagement you had with the accreditation land, because I feel like there's a lot of stuff that's really great here, but I feel like a lot of us know what seems to be the feedback from them, because they seem to be a really large stakeholder in our innovation.
So I get this question a lot, which is interesting, which shows you something. There are a lot of third rails I didn't touch in the book. Tenure was one of them. Athletics was another. I actually talk a little bit about accreditation, and I'm pretty critical of it in the book. To me, the two biggest barriers to innovation right now are accreditation and regulation. And both are under a lot of pressure. And so accreditation, both from the regional accreditors and from the disciplinary accreditors, and then regulation, right? Those people that wanted to start, those three institutions I mentioned that started widespread competency-based programs last year, Northern Arizona, Wisconsin, Southern New Hampshire, by the way, in 3 different regional accrediting agencies. If you talk to any of the officials that did that, most of their time was spent with their accreditors and in Washington dealing with federal financial aid regulations, because neither are very flexible in this, right? So what is happening now is students are pushing up against institutions because students need more flexibility and institutions aren't. Institutions are pushing up against the regulators and the accreditors, right? And so we're eventually, I think, going to see a domino effect here, right? The students eventually push the institutions to be different. Institutions start designing new ways of thinking about the degree, new ways of getting the degree, and then push the accreditors and the regulators in that direction. We're seeing evidence of change. It's slow, and in some ways I think it should be slow, right? I mean, one of the reasons why institutions of higher learning have existed for centuries is because they don't just follow the latest winds, right? Like most on Wall Street do, and why companies don't last very long, right? And by the way, you get one chance at education in my mind, right? You know, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old at home. I said, you know, my oldest is in pre-K. She gets one shot at pre-K. She gets one shot at first grade, right? She gets one, well, we hope. She gets one shot at 5th grade, right? The more we experiment, and if we experiment on those students and the experiment doesn't work, I think that's problematic. So in some ways, we tend, though, in Washington to either be on one side or the other, right? And so we either have very strong regulations or very weak regulations. And we tend to, you know, and I think in every higher education act, when somebody takes advantage of something, we clamp down on it by putting on more regulations. And what I think is going to happen, I hope, especially given some of the wins that some of these early adopters are having, I think that we're going to loosen up on these regulations a little bit. Thus, the accreditors, I think, will also loosen up. It's going to take a while, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we have time for one more question.
This question kind of piggybacks off of what you were just discussing, but our institution, Philadelphia University, has recently been looking a lot of these things. And I sat yesterday through an admissions panel of, you know, different graduate programs in health professions and sort of looked at prerequisite courses. And one of the questions that I have is, how do you see the reconciliation between the early adopters, like Philadelphia University, who just changed their entire gen ed core, that now we don't have a social science, we don't have a humanities course, we have a series of competencies that students have to accomplish, and then how do those students then prove to graduate schools that they have that box?
It's a very good question, but the problem, I think the biggest difference is there's many more options now for students, right? So in terms of proving to graduate schools, there will be some early adopters on the graduate school side There are other now alternative providers who will do that. And so what I think is the biggest change now is because there are so many more players in the system, it doesn't affect your industry as much as it affects, for example, computer science, but a lot of those players I put up there in terms of computer coding and things like that, all have appeared in the last like 2 years, right? And they're getting all of these students because there wasn't a traditional option for many of those students, right? So I think that when students come out of Philadelphia University and they come up against people that won't accept their credits or can't figure out what they did, they're going to go elsewhere, and there will be early adopters for those students. Because I think there's going to be a lot of competition. There's going to be a lot of competition for those students in the future because, as I said, 75% of colleges and universities have either flat or declining net tuition revenue. They have to build new markets of students in the future. Right, in many cases, right, their follow-up question was how will the PA profession deal with this? You're in a very good spot right now, right? So one of the nervousness I had about speaking to this group was that a lot of groups I speak to are in real trouble right now, right? I either speak to institutions that are in real trouble or disciplines that are in real trouble. You know, I spoke to the law school admissions folks a couple of months ago, and boy, talk about a depressing group, right? You know where law school enrollment is gone, right? But think about where law school was 5-6 years ago. They were at their heights. They were at their heights of their applications. And within a couple of years, they went from here to here. And if you asked anybody in that room if they would have predicted that 5 years ago, they wouldn't have, right? So now they're scrambling to come up with a bunch of new ideas. You know, 2-year law degrees and alternative ways of getting into law school. They're trying to come up with every innovation at the last minute now to try to, in some cases, literally survive. So just because you're at the top now, I don't want to end on a down note, but you know, be ready. You have to be ready for change because it could happen overnight. Because trust me, those folks at Blockbuster and Tower Records and all this, they didn't think that it would happen as quickly as it did. And trust me, in journalism, we didn't either. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.